Hello everyone, and welcome back to Beer School, the virtual edition here on YouTube. And today we're going to jump right into some of the hoppier and some of the more popular beers that we sell through all the trends and the precedences and all the changes that's happened to beer over the last several years. The Imperial IPA has been a stalwart kind of favorite among customers ever since the day we opened, which was about 10 years ago. Imperial IPAs are really categorized by their really intense hoppy aroma, really intense hoppy flavor, but they're not so bitter like an American IPA. The ones we talked about last week, they're not quite as bitter as those beers are. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But also they're really noteworthy because of their higher alcohol content. There's a lot of reasons for that, and the reasons really do start with the history of the style. This style does not go back too terribly far. The mid-90s is whenever the Imperial IPA kind of pulled away from the standard American IPA as people on the West Coast started craving a little bit more flavor, a little bit more intensity. They wanted a higher alcohol range. That's just simply how palate shifts work. And the palate shift on the West Coast where, hey, if the American IPA really showcases these West Coast hops, the hops from Washington, the hops from Oregon, Northern California, if it showcases them really well, we want more of that showcase. And as we talked about last week, the intense bitterness you get out of an American IPA really tops off around 70 IBUs. So even though you're talking about an Imperial strength IPA, you can't really go that much further beyond 70 before it's just, number one, you can't notice it, the measure of bitterness, or number two, it's too expensive and cost prohibitive for brewers and customers to enjoy. So if you're going to top out at 70 IBUs, how do you make the beer much more hoppy? Well, you increase the level of hoppiness, not only through bitterness, but you can do the same thing through flavor, and you can do the same thing through aroma. So what you can do is toward the end of that 60-minute boil, if you're the brewer and you're making these Imperial IPAs, you're going to put a lot more malt into the beer to make it stronger. See, the malt is the sweetness, and the sweetness is what the yeast likes. The yeast is going to eat the extra sweetness and turn to extra alcohol. And so that's really where you're looking at the extra ABV coming from whenever it comes to these beers. But if you really want to increase the impression of hoppiness, and probably happiness too, hoppiness, you're going to add more hops toward the end of that boil. So you're going to capture more of the hop flavor and more of the hop aroma. When you turn off the boil and that beer starts to, or that unfermented beer starts to cool a little bit, you can actually add more hops in and retain more aromas as the beer is chilling down. Then you're going to move it on to the fermentation vessels, and that's whenever you're going to add your yeast once the beer has chilled down to the point where it can sustain yeast life. Fermentation starts to happen, and at the end of fermentation, the beer still has to mellow out a little bit. It's not ready to drink right away. It has to go from a very green state to a very mature state. And for the Imperial IPAs, it does happen quickly, but it does take a little bit of time. We're usually looking at a couple of days to maybe a week. During that time when that beer's just hanging out, chilling out, just ripening a little bit, you can add any more hops then. Really what you're asking then is for the alcohol that is already established in the beer through the nature of fermentation, that alcohol starts to act as a solvent, and it starts to strip those oils away from the hop plant. And as that happens, you start to dissolve the hop oils and even some of the resins, the bitter resins, into the beer that way too. The water in the beer and the oils of the hops don't really like to mash up real well. They don't like to dissolve. They don't like to bind. But alcohol will. And so the alcohol soluble molecules in the hops really do a good job of attracting each other. So when the customer gets these beers, you're going to taste the hops more. You're going to smell the hops more, but you're not going to get a whole lot more bitterness. Sometimes a customer will come in here and they'll say, hey, all my friends are really into these hoppy beers. I kind of want to get into them. How do I do it? I'm like, well, if you don't like IPAs, let's start with an Imperial IPA. They'll say, are you crazy? I don't like the standard strength stuff. Why do I want a strong one? The reason why is to understand what Imperial means. The extra sweetness in an Imperial IPA helps take an edge off of that bitterness. And the extra sweetness in these Imperial IPAs really helps the hop aromas, those juicy, citrusy, tropical flavors from the hops, makes them seem more ripe, more plump, much more of a branch ripe or vine ripe kind of characteristic coming from that. So the sweetness actually helps the beer smell and taste more aromatic with the hops. Let's get into Imperial, what Imperial kind of means. Beers are designed differently. They're designed different from an aroma, from a mouthfeel, from a flavor perspective. They're just designed differently. a lot of the beers that fall in under 8% alcohol have the kind of character where there's not so much malt into the beer, where the yeast struggles to ferment all of it, or at least most of it, maybe up to 70 or 80% of it. When that's the case, you end up with a fairly dry, drinkable, refreshing beers. That's where your Pilsners, that's where your wheats, that's even when your standard strength IPAs come from. A beer that whenever you pour, you put it in a bit larger vessel, you can drink it a little quicker. They're not so taxing on the senses. They're a little bit cleaner, crisper, a little bit more simplified of a taste. Whenever you put so much malt sugar, in other words, so much barley malt into the beer, where you start to increase the sugar content of that wort or unfermented beer, what happens then, around 8% alcohol, the character of the beer changes, and your impressions of its flavors, your impressions of its mouthfeel changes too, and you change your behavior because of that. What happens is around 8% alcohol, that's whenever you put so much grain into the beer that this potential for alcohol starts to exceed 8% alcohol. That's whenever the yeast has a hard time metabolizing 70, 80, 90% of those sugars and creating a dry, crisp, or refreshing beer. What happens then is the yeast kind of poops out. Maybe it's 60%, maybe it's 65%, and it leaves maybe 30 or 40% of the residual sweetness into the beer, and that residual sweetness balances out that hop bitterness. But really what it does is increases the level of sweetness on your palate, increases the level of body into the beer, makes it creamier, heavier, fuller, to the point where it's no longer a crisp, refreshing beer. Now you're enjoying the beer for a lot different reason, and it's because it has a little bit more flavor, a little bit more intensity, and you sip on it a little bit more slowly, a little bit more deliberately, so it becomes a much more flavorful beer, much more textural beer, and maybe not meant for refreshing. That's whenever you get a beer, you pour it, you sit by the fire pit or something like that, you sip on it very slowly so you don't have to go back for more beers so quickly. At 8% alcohol, that's whenever our American yeast that's responsible for the fermentation of these beers has a tendency to produce some extra fruity flavors, some extra spicy flavors. Those are the phenols, those are the esters that are naturally produced by fermentation that's not present necessarily in a low alcohol IPA, but a higher alcohol IPA it is. Above 8% alcohol, that's when you can start to taste the alcohol a little bit more readily. The alcohol might be spicy, it might be fruity, it might be solvency, it might be medicinal. So all of a sudden it's another set of flavors for you to contend with on the palate. When all that stuff comes together, you kind of realize I'm just dealing with a more complex beverage. And when I deal with a more complex beverage, that means I sip on it and I contemplate it a little bit more deliberately. So your impressions of the beer changes and your behavior of how you drink the beer changes. Most people won't go after mowing the lawn, get an Imperial IPA and head to the shower. You might do that with a locale IPA or a session IPA, but when it comes to Imperials, it's more like put the dog on your lap or the blanket over you for the winter months. So that's how your impression changes because of these beers. Next, let's get into, okay, we throw around this term hops a lot, but what are hops? Hops is actually a plant that grows about everywhere on the planet. Hops can grow anywhere from the rainforest to the tundras. It's all over the planet. Anywhere you can find vegetation, you can find hops. It's a very sturdy plant. It's a little bit like kudzu or some of those other sort of invasive plants you see around. However, there's only a certain small variety of hops, hop plants that are actually suitable for brewing. And traditionally in Europe, they would call those the noble hops. Noble hops are known because they have more of the aromatic and flavor compounds of the beer rather than the vegetation or bitter or astringent compounds when applied to the beer. We've learned how to cultivate hops in a different way on the West Coast. We've learned how to manipulate their structures. So now all the beers or all the hops that we're growing right now are kind of suitable for brewing. Unless they're wild and you see them out in the wild, they may not be suitable. But what happens is you're going to plant a rhizome. A rhizome is basically a root with little eyes on it. Think of a potato or some other kind of flowers that kind of grow through rhizomes. You're going to plant one of those sections of the roots with an eye on it. Okay, that's what's eventually going to be your hop plant. You can plant it in late winter, early spring. If it snows on top of there, don't worry. This is a very resilient plant. It will start growing eventually and even poke through the snow if you get one of those late snows. As it starts to grow and as it starts to receive the nutrients from the soil, some of the nutrients, some of the moisture from the rain, it really does start to grow quickly. And so once it pops out of the ground, it's going to try to find some sort of trellis or something to grow up. As it grows up, it usually grows counterclockwise to a height of somewhere around 8 to 25 feet, depending on the hop variety. Somewhere around peak summertime condition, it's going to stop growing vertically and want to spread out. It's going to go horizontally, so it develops these little shoots on the end. That's why your trellis needs to have these horizontal portions as well, so that the hop vines can actually grow around it. By the way, a hop plant is called a vine. It's basically a combination of a vine and a branch, and it's a B-I-N-E. So when we talk about hop vines, it's not a mispronunciation, it's not a misspelling, it's actually what it's called. But once those small spindly vines start to grow horizontally, somewhere around the peak of summertime, and by the way, around summertime, 4th of July or so, that's when these hop plants could be growing basically a foot a day in its vertical height and start to spread out a little bit. As it starts to spread out, you'll see these little cones growing on the female hop varieties. The males are useless. Like a lot of other things in society, the male hop plant is useless because they don't grow those little cones. But the hop cone is only available on the female plant. That's its flower. Even though it looks like a very papery, small, green pine cone, it's actually a flower. It never gets hard, it never gets brown, it never gets brittle. It stays kind of thin, and as it gets papery, it starts to achieve its peak maturity. When that happens, you can actually pull apart those hop plants or those hop cones, and you can see stuff inside there. It's yellow, it's sticky, it looks like pollen. But that's the oils and resins that are really important to the brewers. What's going to happen is late, somewhere around the first frost is whenever brewers try to get ahead of the game a little bit, or I'm sorry, the hop growers start to get ahead of the game, and they want to cultivate or pick those hops at that point to ensure the peak freshness before the frost comes and starts to oxidize the plant too much. At some point, the hop plant is going to put all of its energy into establishing a healthy root system, and it's going to start ignoring all the health of the plant from the ground up. That ensures that hop can grow back next year. So whenever that starts to get neglected, the stalk, the vines, and then the flowers, as they start to get neglected, that's whenever you see an oxidation happen to the hop plant. So the hop growers try to get ahead of the game and pick them before that happens. So they're going to pick these hops and they're going to dry them out. They have to dry them out to get rid of the moisture so they don't rot or so they don't mold, so you can leave them intact. And there's actually some benefit to brewers through that drying out process. So what that does, it really does make sure that the hop oils and resins have a chance to kind of degrade a little bit and actually become more aromatic and more flavorful. That's called the bending process, and as the hops are bended, then they're shipped to hop distributors. Then after that, it's sent to the brewers, and that's whenever the brewers are going to use them during the boiling phases, and after the fact, during the fermentation phases, and even beyond that, during the conditioning phases of the beer. So that's kind of where we are when it comes to Imperial IPA. Some great examples that we have for you today are the old school 90-minute IPA. As this style become popular, remember Dogfish Head is one of those East Coast brewers, so it had a little bit more of that English influence whenever it comes to balance and when it comes to flavor. So the 90-minute IPA can have a little bit more of an ester profile, which is a fruity profile to go along with the hop profile to add to the level of complexity whenever it comes to the fruit components of the hops. Also, there's a little bit more of a malt balance whenever it comes to Dogfish Head's 90-minute IPA, but keep in mind this is still a very hop-dominant beer, where there's no way this is going to rival a barley wine or an old ale or anything like that. Like Anita says, this has been out for quite some time. It's the Brown Sugar. Brown Sugar used to be a little bit more of an American strong ale. In other words, it's probably equal part malt, equal part hops, but high in alcohol content. Over the years, I've noticed this beer changing. It's less dependent on the malt now than it's ever been, and a little bit more reliant on the hop characteristic. So this is basically an Imperial IPA that kind of edges slightly toward those strong ale or barley wine territories a little bit, but make no mistake about it, the hops are still front and center in this one as well. Great Lakes Chill Wave. This beer is probably coming up on 5 or 6 years old now. Really nice beer. This is a little bit of a game changer, seasonal for Great Lakes Brewing Company. This is their most popular IPA that they sell here. It's really nice. It has a lot of the newer hops that's responsible for this high aromatics, high fruit flavors, and just it gives it a very ripe sensation from the fruit standpoint. So those are 3 really good examples of a little bit more of an old school type of flavor. Moving on to something that's a little bit newer, just like we talked about last week, how the IPA has developed. The week before that, we talked about how the pale ale has developed. Imperial IPAs have done much of the same. When we talk about Imperial beers being 8% or higher, Stone Brewing Company comes in with it where they consider an Imperial IPA that's 7.7%. It's not quite 8%. Their goal with this is to make a beer that's discernibly higher than a standard IPA, but one that's not so high where the malt influence or the linger of malt interferes with the flavors at all. This has become a very dry beer, even though it approaches Imperial IPA status. Their goal here is to make the beer so dry that it actually ferments out some of the proteins and some of the carbohydrates responsible for making this beer a high gluten beer. As a matter of fact, it falls so low in the gluten ranges that it qualifies as a gluten-free beer. Anything gluten-free is considered a product that's less than 20 parts per million gluten, and I think this one comes in considerably lower than that. So for the gluten-free, intolerant folks out there that like beer, maybe this is an option that you can handle. Against the Grain, one of the more popular Imperial IPAs, very steady seller for us. It's a really nice beer. The universal cheat code for any kind of hoppy beer is Citra hops. Citra hops is the most popular hop variety out there because, as its name suggests, has a very big citrus component. A lot of tangerine, orange peel, blood orange, mandarin oranges, all this orange kind of flavors, just juicy, radiant, comes through very strongly in any kind of beer that uses Citra hops. And in this beer, Against the Grain uses exclusively that hop variety to flavor their beer, to bitter their beer, and bring out big, bold citronella aromatics. Has a bitterness that's a little bit more on the spicier hemp-like side. Really nice beer. So anytime you if you have a beer or homebrewers at home, you think you have an average IPA recipe you want to build, throw Citra hops in it and it's automatically great. All right, so wrapping up, Can of Bliss is Oscar Blues, one of their new offerings. Can of Bliss is a series of IPAs. They made a hazy, they made a citrus. This one is the Imperial, the double IPA. Very smooth, very well balanced, a little bit creamier. They're actually borrowing some of the trends of the hazy IPAs to make this beer a little bit more radiant, a little bit more juicy, a little bit more, just give it a little bit more oomph without hurting any sense of drinkability. Dangerously smooth for this guy, so if you buy these and drink those, slow down. You want to drink it fast, but it'll catch up with you in a big hurry. Moving on, last week we talked about glassware with IPAs, and Imperial IPAs are the same as any other kind of hoppy beer. Hoppy beers have a tendency to have developed a glassware that suits them really, really well. A lot of people prefer glass like this. It reminds me a little bit of a tulip, but it doesn't flare out the top. It kind of comes up a little bit straight. Has a bulb enough to include the volume that you need on this, but also something that feels very comfortable in your hands, something you can actually drink really well. You can get your nose on top of the rim, pick up all those aromatics. So it makes the beer look very appealing. It captures that head character because it's constricted a little bit at the top. It builds that head a little bit more. If the beer looks good, you eat with your eyes, guess what? You drink with your eyes too. So the beer looks appealing, it smells appealing. You're sold that you like the beer even before you taste it, and sometimes the glassware has a lot to do with why that happens. Another glass that's really suitable for Imperial IPAs is basically a large snifter, a brandy snifter, or an oversized wine glass. Anything that has bulb, kind of tapers like that, Imperial beers are well suited for those kind of glasses. Again, it concentrates aromas, it builds that head characteristic, and gives you a little bit of swirling action you can do to release more of those bubbles and regenerate the flavors, regenerate the textures, and do all that. So that's a great way to go about that. 45 to 50 degrees is usually where I like to drink these beers. Big enough so that the aromas really start to pop out a little bit more, but not so warm that it starts to push the carbonation out of the beer too fast, and not so warm where the alcohol likes to stand out. And somewhere around 45 or 50 degrees is where I like these beers. I might open it a little bit cooler than that and let it warm up over time, so that my palate grows up with the beer and it releases more secrets as the session endures. So that's a great way to go about that as well. Whenever it comes to food pairings, whenever it comes to Imperial IPAs, you can go a little bit on the bolder side. When it comes to cheeses, a very sharp cheddar. Don't be afraid to go really sharp on that cheddar. That sharpness of the cheese really does well with the bitterness of the beer. You can go with something a little tamer, a little earthier. I like blue cheese, but don't go with a really big blue, not a Stilton. Go with a Gorgonzola Dulce, something a little bit milder, something a little creamier, kind of soothe that bitterness, but yeah, it adds kind of earthiness to go along with the earthy nature of the hops. There's a lot of resonance there, there's a lot of contrast. Really like what those cheeses do with these. Entrees, go bold again, go spicy, go floral, go with a beef curry. Something like the Indian or Thai, all those flavors do real well with these Imperial IPAs. Ginger as a dessert has a certain affinity for these beers as well, so don't be afraid to go with ginger snaps, carrot cake, just something big, bold, spicy. It always works out pretty well. Big question is, do you age these beers? And my answer is no, but with a few exceptions. Imperial IPAs are usually prized for their hop aroma and their hop flavor. And in Imperial IPAs, those are the flavors and aromas that's going to see themselves most susceptible to aging. So as these beers go 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, you're going to start to see that lose that. And usually people, whenever they taste that loss, they say, okay, it's not as good because there's not enough of other flavors to make up that difference and improve upon the beer over what it was when it was fresh. But there are some exceptions. Dark Horse makes one, the Double Crooked Tree. The maltiness in that beer and the alcohol has a tendency to age very well. So even though the hop aroma and flavor may drop out, those other components are improving. So you get some trade-offs. It depends on what you like in that trade-off, whether you prefer a beer, an Imperial IPA with some age or not. Another one is Dogfish Head 120 minute. That's an easy one to say yes, that IPA will age well, because it's really not an IPA. It's a highly hopped American barley wine, but it's got a lot of other complexities that do real well as the beer goes down the road, and so that one can hold up to age for years. So whenever you taste a beer, smell a beer, and if it's just a one dimensional dialogue between the hops and the malt support, then that beer may not age well. But if it's got a lot of other complexities where the hops isn't the only thing you think about, then it might have a tendency to age out a little bit better anyway. IPAs, I kind of like to see a week or two, maybe 3 weeks on them, because the alcohol could be a bit unruly. The bitterness in in Imperial IPAs have the tendency to expand the alcohol, make it too spicy. So after some time, those things calm down quickly. With just a couple of weeks it matters, so that conditioning phase might matter quite a bit. This is the part where we start to wrap up, and I tell you what we're doing next week, but I have no idea what we're doing next week. I want to stay on the hoppy trend, but we don't have enough of the beers in right now for me to do a hazy, or for me to do a low-cal, or to do a black IPA, or Belgian IPA. We just don't have enough of those varieties in right now. If that happens throughout the week, then I'm going to include those. Basically what it means is I don't get paid enough to think that far in advance. So we're going to have to wait until Tuesday, and then I'll put it up on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, what we're going to be doing. So hopefully tune in then. So thank you guys very much, and I'll see you next week.